everyone, and welcome back to Their Own Words.
History from those who lived it.
My name is Danny.
And I'm Ava.
Today, we are going to be talking about quite literally our most famous Victorian. She loaned her name to this period in history. And if you're listening to this podcast, she probably needs no introduction. But in case you're a little fuzzy on the details, Queen Victoria was the Queen of Britain and its empire from 1837 to 1901.
She was also the late Queen Elizabeth's great-grandmother. Through Victoria, many European royals are actually related. So her grandson, for example, George V, was cousins with the German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar, which is pretty wild. If you Google these guys, they actually look very similar. Queen Victoria was a towering figure, and she sadly lost her husband, Prince Albert, when she was still rather young. Both he and she were around the age of 42 when he passed away. And yet Queen Victoria still had to go on and rule a country for the next 40 years. And she was very devastated by the death of her husband because she was very much devoted to him. She also had 9 children by him. They had great affection for one another, quite similarly actually to our couple from our last episode, Robert and Maria, but with a bit of a royal twist.
Yeah, she's famous for being quite involved in affairs of state, even though she ascended the throne at just 18. We have documentation which even tells us she was not a fan of being pregnant, apparently because it drew her away from these affairs of state. She really liked to be involved with government.
Yeah, and Britain really came into its own during her reign, which began around the tail end of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution ended approximately in 1840, and Queen Victoria came to the throne, as we said, in 1837. And an additional point of note is that the anti-monarchist sentiment, which was quite rife around the time of Queen Victoria's predecessors, George III and George IV, sort of faded away as Queen Victoria's reign progressed. She sort of gave the monarchy a new lease on life. She was really well liked and admired by the British public, much the same way as Queen Elizabeth was.
What we're going to do in this episode is give you guys a look inside the head that wore the crown. If you Google Queen Victoria, you'll find tons of information on her. Thousands of books have been written about her and about her loving marriage to Prince Albert. But we're going to read you some of her diary entries and private correspondence to really give you some insight into who she was as a person. She wrote in her diary constantly, so as a result, we have a lot of source material to draw from. Now, I should add a disclaimer here that Queen Victoria's diaries, as we have them, were heavily edited and recopied by one of her daughters. So we don't know exactly what was taken out or what was recopied. So keep that in mind as we go through these, and also note that we're not going through everything, but we've cherry-picked a few that we find interesting. Without further ado then, I hope you guys enjoy this episode, hearing from Queen Victoria in her own words.
So the first diary entry we're going to read was written on Tuesday, the 20th of June, 1837 at Kensington Palace. And for context, this diary entry was written on William IV's death and her accession to the throne, aged 18 years. She says, "I was awoke at 6 o'clock by Mamma, who told me that the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Conyngham were here and wished to see me. I got out of bed and went into my sitting room, only in my dressing gown and alone, and saw them. Lord Conyngham, the Lord Chamberlain, then acquainted me that my poor uncle, the King, was no more, and had expired at 12 minutes past 2 this morning, and consequently that I am Queen. Lord Conyngham knelt down and kissed my hand, at the same time delivering to me the official announcement of the poor King's demise. The Archbishop then told me that the Queen was desirous that he should come and tell me the details of the last moments of my poor, good uncle. He said that he had directed his mind to religion and had died in a perfectly happy, quiet state of mind, and was quite prepared for his death. He added that the King's sufferings at the last time were not very great, but that there was a good deal of uneasiness. Lord Conyngham, whom I charged to express my feelings of condolence and sorrow to the poor Queen, returned directly to Windsor. I then went to my room and dressed. Since it has pleased Providence to place me in this station, I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country. I am very young, and perhaps in many, though not in all things, inexperienced. But I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have." There's so much good stuff in here that we can talk about. What a wonderful lady.
Yeah, she is. Well, let's start by talking about how she's 18 years old. I cannot imagine as an 18-year-old being approached by adults and given the responsibility of running and representing an entire country.
And to have such composure as she hears this news and takes on this duty, she writes with such maturity and such composure.
It's true, and she just says she's resigned herself to it, but not in a negative way. It's pleased Providence to place me in this station. I should do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country. I love this so much because she is the queen, but it's not as if she equates her status with the ability to rule freely and do whatever she likes. Yeah. She feels a duty to the nation that she represents, not as if her position is one to be lorded over everyone.
No, but as if she's actually serving country.
Exactly.
She's in a position of servitude. And I love the next line, I am very young and perhaps in many, though not in all things inexperienced, but I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have. Again, this just expounds further on her humility, the fact that she recognizes that she's quite young and inexperienced, but also her motivations for being queen. I mean, this was her private innermost thoughts being recorded. This isn't some public statement that she's setting out for everyone to see and wants to present her best foot forward. These are her innermost thoughts. This is her private diary. And so we see from the get-go that her motivations as a queen were to do what is right and fit, and she had goodwill.
Her motivations were very pure. Exactly. It was not a performance, not staged, very contrary to many politicians who prep their acceptance speeches for months. So I think this is really quite a very astounding entry.
Okay, so continuing on with the diary entry. At 9 came Lord Melbourne, who I saw in my room, and of course quite alone, as I shall always do all my ministers. He kissed my hand, and I then acquainted him that it had long been my intention to retain him and the rest of the present ministry at the head of affairs, and that it could not be in better hands than his. He then read to me the declaration, which I was to read to the council, which he wrote himself, and which is a very fine one. I then talked with him some little longer time, after which he left me. I like him very much and feel confidence in him. He is a very straightforward, honest, clever, and good man. I then wrote a letter to the Queen. At about 11:30, I went downstairs and held a council in the Red Saloon. I went in, of course, quite alone, and remained seated the whole time. My two uncles, the Dukes of Cumberland, who now succeeded William IV as King of Hanover, and Sussex, and Lord Melbourne conducted me. The declaration, the various forms, the swearing in of the Privy Councillors, of which there were a great number present, and the reception of some of the Lords of Council. Previous to the council and in an adjacent room, likewise alone, I subjoin here. I was not at all nervous and had the satisfaction of hearing that people were satisfied with what I had done and how I had done it. Receiving after this audiences of Lord Melbourne, Lord John Russell, Lord Albemarle, Master of the Horse, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, all in my room and alone. Saw Stockmar, who was a friend and a counsellor to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Saw Clark, whom I named my physician. Saw Ernest Hohenlohe, who brought me a kind and very feeling letter from the poor Queen. I feel very much for her, and really feel that the poor good King was always so kind personally to me, that I should be ungrateful were I not to recollect it, and feel grieved at his death. The poor Queen is wonderfully composed now, I hear. Wrote my journal, took my dinner upstairs alone, went downstairs, saw Stockmar. At about 9:20 came Lord Melbourne, and remained till near 10. I had a very important and very comfortable conversation with him. Went down and said good night to Mamma, etc.
Okay, so one of the things I want to note here is the immediate presence of Lord Melbourne, who was a very important person in Victoria's life. She, as she writes, felt confidence in him. He was a close advisor to her as Prime Minister and would continue to be, really until his death. Less so when she married Prince Albert, because Albert obviously took the role of closest advisor, but he was a very important character. And I also think it's interesting that she says she took her dinner alone. So on the biggest day of her life, really, she decides to recluse, spend some time with her thoughts, and sort of decompress, take it all in. I like that we also get the description of the swearing in of the Privy Council. We've actually just for the first time seen this televised with the accession of King Charles III. That was the first time people could actually see what happens in that ceremony, though there have been dramatic depictions of this as well. The Young Victoria, which is a pretty good film about Queen Victoria's life, and also in the Netflix series The Crown, you get a little bit of this, but very impressive ceremony, she says she wasn't nervous, even though this is really a huge deal. So I think if people were to watch some of these dramatic depictions or the televised version in which King Charles actually swears in his Privy Council, I think you can get an idea of how nervous you could be in one of these scenarios. I mean, the room is filled with people looking at you, and there's an enormous amount of pressure on your shoulders, and yet she says she wasn't bothered by it, which is quite interesting.
And for me, something that really stuck out to me was she's quite generous in terms of the way that she speaks about people. She's quite complimentary towards them. She speaks about Lord Melbourne, who she clearly holds in high regard. She also speaks about her feelings for the Queen and says, I feel very much for her. So even in this moment where there's this immense pressure on her and she could be thinking about any number of things, she still takes time to reflect on how the Queen must be feeling as she's just lost her husband. She's quite reflective without being over emotional.
Mm-hmm. It's like you said, she's very composed. Yeah. Very impressive for a young woman of 18.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this next diary entry is a bit of a long one, but for good reason. It is the coronation day. So this was Thursday, the 28th of June, 1838.
Big day.
Big day. And an early start. She says, I was awoke at 4 o'clock by the guns in the park and could not get much sleep afterwards on account of the noise of the people, bands, etc. Got up at 7 feeling strong and well. The park presented a curious spectacle. Crowds of people up to Constitution Hill, soldiers, bands, etc. I dressed, having taken a little breakfast before I dressed, and a little after. At 9:30, I went into the next room, dressed exactly in my House of Lords costume. At 10, I got into the state coach with the Duchess of Sutherland and Lord Albemarle, and we began our progress. It was a fine day, and the crowds of people exceeded what I have ever seen. Many as there were the day I went to the city, it was nothing to the multitudes, the millions of my loyal subjects who were assembled in every spot to witness the procession. Their good humour and excessive loyalty was beyond everything, and I really cannot say how proud I feel to be the queen of such a nation. I was alarmed at times for fear that the people would be crushed and squeezed on account of the tremendous rush and pressure. I just want to pause here and note that I love this part, that even on this incredible day that's all about her, essentially, she again is so rooted in the fact that she is a servant of the nation, and she seems to be so other-centered. So she even says, I was alarmed at times for fear that the people would be crushed and squeezed on account of the tremendous rush and pressure. So she's not worried even about her own safety. She's worried about other people.
Yeah, she's very considerate.
Okay, back to the diary entry. I reached the Abbey, Westminster, amid deafening cheers at a little after 11:30. I first went into a robing room quite close to the entrance, where I found my 8 train bearers, all dressed alike and beautifully, in white satin and silver tissue, with wreaths of silver corn ears in front, and a small one of pink roses around the plait behind, and pink roses in the trimming of the dresses. After putting on my mantle, and the young ladies having properly got hold of it, and Lord Conyngham holding the end of it, I left the robing room, and the procession began. The sight was splendid. The bank of peeresses, quite beautiful, all in their robes, and the peers on the other side. My young train-bearers were always near me, and helped me whenever I wanted anything. The Bishop of Durham stood on one side near me. At the beginning of the anthem, I retired to St. Edward's Chapel, a small dark place immediately behind the altar, with my ladies and train-bearers. Took off my crimson robe and kirtle, and put on a supertunica of cloth of gold, also in the shape of a kirtle, which was put over a singular sort of little gown of linen trimmed with lace. I also took off my circlet of diamonds, and then proceeded bareheaded into the abbey. I was then seated upon St. Edward's chair, where the dalmatic robe was clasped round me by the Lord Great Chamberlain. Then followed all the various things, and last of those things, the crown being placed on my head, which was, I must own, a most beautiful, impressive moment. All the peers and peeresses put on their coronets at the same instant. The shouts, which were very great, the drums, the trumpets, the firing of the guns, all at the same instant, rendered the spectacle most imposing.
Okay, I have to interject here because I am such a nerd about this stuff, and I love it so much. There is so much ceremony here, and it is steeped in tradition, it's steeped in religion, and it's fascinating. If any of you are interested in this stuff, there's a guy on YouTube who does a really good job breaking this down. We have another coronation, a royal coronation, happening in a little less than a month with Charles III. This guy's name is Alan Barton, the antiquary, and he breaks down the coronation ceremony, the tradition of the coronation ceremony, what it means for the peers and the peeresses, for those who aren't familiar with those terms, the lords and ladies, essentially, of the realm, and their coronets and the robes that they wear. You can find some images of coronations and what they look like, and I think it will really overwhelm you when you start to picture yourself in this crowd and at this incredible ceremony. Also, Queen Elizabeth's coronation was filmed in 1953, and you can see that as well if you're interested.
And a dalmatic robe is a robe with wide sleeves.
And the supertunica is similar to priestly vestments.
I just love how she says when the crown is being placed on her head, quote, which was, I must own, a most beautiful, impressive moment. The way she words it makes it seem as if she's almost embarrassed to say that it's a great, proud moment for her because she's so modest that she has to prelude that by saying, I must own.
She is not vain. She is overwhelmed and a little bit ashamed that she takes great pride in this moment.
Yeah.
Which is amazing. I mean, as a monarch, to have everyone subject to you, people talk differently around you, walk differently around you, and yet still feel very humble, that's quite a remarkable person.
Yeah. Okay, back to the diary entry. The enthronization and the homage of first all the bishops, then my uncles, and lastly of all the peers, in their respective order, was very fine. The Duke of Norfolk, holding for me the sceptre with the cross, with Lord Melbourne, stood close to me on my right, and the Duke of Richmond, with the other sceptre, on my left. All my train-bearers standing behind the throne. Poor old Lord Roll, who is 82 and dreadfully infirm, in attempting to ascend the steps fell and rolled quite down, but was not the least hurt. When he attempted to reascend them, I got up and advanced to the end of the steps in order to prevent another fall.
So this is kind of a comedy of errors here. An 82-year-old peer falls down the stairs on his way up. And again, she's being considerate because she attempts to prevent another fall by getting around him. And I wonder if all of her consideration for other people is somewhat due to the fact that she's still kind of a child at this point. She's still deferent to her elders. And so she just has this respect for other people.
Yeah. When Lord Melbourne's turn to do homage came, there was loud cheering. They also cheered Lord Grey and the Duke of Wellington. It's a pretty ceremony. They first all touched the crown and then kissed my hand. When my good Lord Melbourne knelt down and kissed my hand, he pressed my hand and I grasped his with all my heart, at which he looked up with his eyes filled with tears and seemed much touched, as he was, I observed, throughout the whole ceremony. After the homage was concluded, I left the throne, took off my crown and received the sacrament. I then put on my crown again and reascended the throne, leaning on Lord Melbourne's arm. At the commencement of the anthem, I descended from the throne and went into St. Edward's Chapel, where I took off the dalmatic robe, supertunica, and put on the purple velvet kirtle and mantle, and proceeded again to the throne, which I ascended, leaning on Lord Melbourne's hand. I then again descended from the throne and repaired with all the peers bearing the regalia, my ladies and train-bearers, to St. Edward's Chapel, as it is called, but which, as Lord Melbourne said, was more unlike a chapel than anything he had ever seen, for what was called an altar was covered with sandwiches, bottles of wine, etc. The Archbishop came in and ought to have delivered the orb to me, but I had already got it. There we waited for some minutes. The procession being formed, I replaced my crown. Which I had taken off for a few minutes, took the orb in my left hand and the sceptre in my right, and thus loaded proceeded through the abbey, which resounded with cheers, to the first robing room, and here we waited for at least an hour, with all my ladies and train-bearers. The princesses went away about half an hour before I did. The Archbishop had put the ring on the wrong finger, and the consequence was that I had the greatest difficulty to take it off again, which I at last did with great pain. At about 4:30, I re-entered my carriage, the crown on my head and sceptre and orb in my hand, and we proceeded the same way as we came, the crowds, if possible, having increased. The enthusiasm, affection, and loyalty was really touching, and I shall ever remember this day as the proudest of my life. I came home at a little after 6, really not feeling tired. At 8 we dined. My kind Lord Melbourne was much affected in speaking of the whole ceremony. He asked kindly if I was tired, said the sword he carried was excessively heavy. I said that the crown hurt me a good deal. He was much amused at Uncle Ernest's being astonished at our still having the litany. We agreed that the whole thing was a very fine sight. He thought the rose, and particularly the dalmatic, looked remarkably well. The archbishop's and the dean's copes, which were remarkably handsome, were from James I's time. The very same that were worn at his coronation, Lord Melbourne told me.
We get some more context for her relationship with Lord Melbourne here. Now, she is known to have been very close with him. He was a close advisor to her until he died. He was much older than her. There is some speculation on whether their relationship was romantic. We don't have any clear evidence for this, but yet you see, even in the way she describes their interactions with one another during the coronation ceremony and afterward, that there is something special about the relationship they have together. Melbourne didn't have a great relationship with his wife, and Queen Victoria was, on the whole, missing a father figure. Her father died when she was quite young, which is why she was in line for the throne to begin with. I think she was basically just born, and then her father died. And the father, quote unquote, that she had was her mother's advisor, Sir John Conroy. And I'm speculating a bit here, but it seems to me that he was very domineering and controlling and, on the whole, not greatly admired by her. So Lord Melbourne comes in and is sort of this older man who can guide her and befriends her and perhaps sort of fills a void for her until she meets her husband.
Yeah, he's someone she can lean on.
Yeah.
And does physically lean
yeah.
on him in this entry. I want to reflect on some of the religious theme in this ceremony. Church and state at this time are still very much intertwined, and we see Christian tradition very much at the fore throughout the coronation. And when you think about coronations, it is very much a church service, and it harkens back to the divine right of kings and how monarchs were supposed to be God's representatives on earth. We get a sense here of Queen Victoria's reverence for this Christian tradition. And throughout her diary, religion figures quite prominently. Even if we refer back to the first diary entry that we read this episode, she makes note of how the late king, quote, had directed his mind to religion and had died in a perfectly happy, quiet state of mind. The fact that she notes this in her diary implies that this is something both important and comforting to her.
Yeah, that's true. And like you said, it was very much a religious ceremony. She talks about receiving the sacrament. So this was a church service, and the monarch was meant to be blessed by God, surrounded by all of these other people as witnesses. Okay, so moving on to our next primary source, we are reading a letter from Queen Victoria to Florence Nightingale. This is dated January 1856, which is during the Crimean War, if you remember us talking about that in our previous episode on Florence.
So that's why we wanted to read this letter to you, because it's a cool crossover between Florence Nightingale and Queen Victoria. It reads, "You are, I know, well aware of the high sense I entertain of the Christian devotion which you have displayed during this great and bloody war, and I need hardly repeat to you how warm my admiration is for your services, which are fully equal to those of my dear and brave soldiers, whose sufferings you have had the privilege of alleviating in so merciful a manner. I am, however, anxious of marking my feelings in a manner which I trust will be agreeable to you, and therefore send you with this letter a brooch, the form and emblems of which commemorate your great and blessed work, and which I hope you will wear as a mark of the high approbation of your sovereign. It will be a very great satisfaction to me, when you return at last to these shores, to make the acquaintance of one who has set so bright an example to our sex." So this is a very cool letter. She's essentially writing a letter to accompany a gift that she's giving to Florence Nightingale, thanking her for her great service. The gift that she gave was a brooch, which had St. George's cross on it in red enamel, as well as the royal cipher with a crown in diamonds. It also had an inscription that read, "Blessed are the merciful."
So this is really interesting. We just talked about how she's a reverent Christian, and that figures prominently in her diaries. And she is commending Florence for, quote, the Christian devotion which she has displayed during the Crimean War. And then even the inscription on this award here says, "Blessed are the merciful," which is straight out of the Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel in the Bible. So religion, very important. We talk about these strict mores of the Victorian era, the high standard to which everyone was called to live according to Christian values. And Victoria is very much a reason for this. She took her faith seriously, and as a result, the Victorian era was marked by and enthusiasm for the Christian faith.
I love how she gives this brooch essentially as a way of commemorating Florence Nightingale's great work. And she talks about how Florence Nightingale has set so bright an example to her sex. And she also notes that she believes that Florence Nightingale's services to her country are equal to those of the soldiers, which I thought was quite neat.
And she's looking forward to meeting her. Obviously, they haven't met at this point yet, so she notes that there and looking forward to meeting her. Mm-hmm. This is a woman she really admires and someone she can look up to. And I think that's really neat is, again, Queen Victoria doesn't see her station as queen as putting her above everyone else. She still has these people that she admires who are very much outside of her class, and she's really appreciative of the work that Florence does.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next source we're going to read is also a letter, and it was written on the 20th of December, 1861, by Queen Victoria to her uncle, King Leopold of Belgium. And the context of this letter is the death of Queen Victoria's beloved husband, Prince Albert, who died from typhoid on the 14th of December, 1861, at the age of 42. So we just have an excerpt here of this letter, and it starts mid-sentence. To be cut off in the prime of life, to see our pure, happy, quiet domestic life, which alone enabled me to bear my much disliked position, cut off at 42, when I had hoped with such instinctive certainty that God would never part us, and would let us grow old together, is too awful, too cruel. So this is a sad one. She clearly has so much love and devotion to her husband, and I think it's really interesting that she notes A, that she disliked her position as queen, and B, that it was her husband alone who enabled her to endure this position and do it with such joy.
You're right. He was a major support to her throughout her reign, and I feel like she felt that loss very keenly when he was not there. Albert frequently took the reins when she was pregnant and unable to attend to affairs of state, and even when he wasn't running the kingdom in her absence, she sought his advice on many topics. I think they had a kind of similar relationship to the late Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. They really did rely on each other, I think, in many aspects. Yeah. And the fact that they did everything together, all the tours, all the visits, all the innumerable duties that come with being heads of state, I think they were indispensable to one another. And unfortunately for Queen Victoria, she had to do 40 years on the throne, 40 years of life without her husband.
And something that's important to note is that the recipient of this letter is not King Leopold II, who is the one we associate with all the heinous crimes that took place in the Congo. This is King Leopold I of Belgium, who was his father.
Yeah, and King Leopold I was Victoria's uncle, but he was also Prince Albert's uncle and was instrumental in them forming a relationship.
Okay, the next source we're going to read to you is a letter from Queen Victoria to the recently widowed Earl Canning on the 10th of January, 1862. So this is less than a month after her own husband has died. And she speaks in the third person here. Lord Canning little thought when he wrote his kind and touching letter of the 22nd of November that it would only reach the Queen when she was smitten and bowed down to the earth by an event similar to the one which he describes. To lose one's partner in life is, as Lord Canning knows, like losing half of one's body and soul, torn forcibly away. And dear Lady Canning was such a dear, worthy, devoted wife. But to the Queen, to a poor helpless woman, it is not that only. It is the stay, support, and comfort which is lost. To the Queen, it is like death in life. Great and small, nothing was done without his loving advice and help, and she feels alone in the wide world, with many helpless children, and the whole nation to look to her. Now, when she can barely struggle with her wretched existence, her misery, her utter despair, she cannot describe. Her only support, the only ray of comfort she gets for a moment, is in the firm conviction and certainty of his nearness, his undying love, and of their eternal reunion. May God comfort and support Lord Canning, and may he think in his sorrow of his widowed and broken-hearted sovereign. So, from this letter, we clearly get the sense that Victoria is grieving deeply, and this is only less than a month after her beloved husband has died. And she makes it very clear that she is miserable and how much Albert meant to her, while also empathizing with Lord Canning and the loss of his wife, who was a friend to the Queen as well.
Yeah, she's obviously not gotten over the death of Albert, and it's almost as if in trying to sympathize with Lord Canning, she's wallowing in her own misery at the same time. She uses this letter not only as a formal letter of sympathy, but as a means to get her own feelings down on paper.
Yeah.
Okay, the very last thing we're going to read to you guys is Queen Victoria's diary from the Golden Jubilee, which took place in 1887.
It reads, "This very eventful day has come and is past. It will be very difficult to describe it, but all went off admirably. This day 50 years ago I had to go with a full sovereign's escort to St. James's Palace to appear at my proclamation, which was very painful to me, and is no longer to take place. The morning was beautiful and bright with a fresh air. Troops began passing early with bands playing, and one heard constant cheering. The scene outside was most animated and reminded me of the opening of the Great Exhibition, which also took place on a very fine day. Received many beautiful nosegays and presents. At the door of Westminster Abbey, I was received by the clergy, with the Archbishop of Canterbury and Dean at their head, in the copes of rich velvet and gold, which had been worn at the coronation. The crowds from the palace gates up to the Abbey were enormous, and there was such an extraordinary outburst of enthusiasm as I had hardly ever seen in London before. All the people seemed to be in such good humour. The decorations along Piccadilly were quite beautiful, and there were most touching inscriptions. When all was ready, the procession was formed. God Save the Queen was played, as I walked slowly up the nave and choir, which looked beautiful, all filled with people. The royalties of highest rank were seated within the altar rails. I sat alone. Oh, without my beloved husband, for whom this would have been such a proud day, where I sat 49 years ago and received the homage of the princes and peers, but in the old coronation chair of Edward III, with the old stone brought from Scotland on which the old kings of Scotland used to be crowned. My robes were beautifully draped on the chair. The service was very well done and arranged. The Te Deum, by my darling Albert, sounded beautiful. When the service was concluded, each of my sons, sons-in-law, grandsons, including little Alfred, and grandsons-in-law stepped forward, bowed, and in succession kissed my hand. And the same with the daughters, daughters-in-law, granddaughters, and the granddaughter-in-law. They curtsied as they came up, and I embraced them warmly. It was a very moving moment, and tears were in some of their eyes." So the next morning she's reflecting on the Jubilee celebrations, and she says, "The illuminations last night are said to have been splendid. Thousands thronged the streets, but there was no disorder. They shouted and sang till quite late, and passed the palace singing God Save the Queen and Rule Britannia. Went into the garden for a little while, and on coming home rested. Quantities of telegrams still continued coming in. These 2 days will ever remain indelibly impressed in my mind, with great gratitude to that all-merciful Providence, who has protected me so long, and to my devoted and loyal people. But how painfully do I miss the dear ones I have lost."
I love this entry because it really sums up Queen Victoria's life. This entry is 25 years after the death of Prince Albert, and she still feels his absence very keenly. She's very sad that he can't be with her. She's also still invoking Providence. She invokes Providence in the first entry, and we read also in this last one, she invokes it again, because her faith was very important to her. And it's really extraordinary, these 50 years on the throne, because these very long reigns were very uncommon. And the celebrations that were used to mark the occasion, I think, once again reflects that she really was a beloved monarch, and even if not beloved, had the respect of her people, just as Queen Elizabeth did.
Well, until Queen Elizabeth II, Victoria was the longest reigning monarch.
Yeah, that's true, actually. In sum, I think this entry really rounds out our episode on Victoria quite nicely. I think she was a caring, dutiful, passionate, faithful, and on the whole, really remarkable woman and queen. That's all we have for you guys today. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can email us at theirownwordspod@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.